Dysfunctionality, definitely. Um, One thing that I think people always need to remember is that there isn't really a Trump administration. There is President Trump, and he has people around him. They are not fully empowered decision makers who can lead. They are there to do what he tells them to do. And Trump changes his mind or veers left and veers right fairly regularly. So the people we have sometimes speaking publicly aren't actually sure what we're doing because it's only President Trump.
Hello and welcome to Times Radio Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1373 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very fortunate to be speaking to Ambassador Kurt Volker. Now, Ambassador Volker, a former senior US diplomat with lots of experience and relationships at the highest levels of US, European and Eurasian diplomatic policy. Former US ambassador to NATO, US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, a former executive director at the McCain Institute, and now a distinguished fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis and a senior international advisor for the BGR Group. Ambassador Volker, welcome to Times Radio Frontline.
A couple of the other things that you might have wanted to mention is that I co-founded in 2022 the American University in Kyiv. So it's a partnership with Arizona State University. We have about 700 students and some very serious business investors. We have internships for students placed in the West. We have the opportunity for them to continue their education at Arizona State University or just stay in Ukraine and get an American University degree of the highest quality. So it's been a great initiative.
What an amazing initiative. And how relevant it is, because we're going to talk a little bit about Ukraine, I think, today. And you know, it's come back into the headlines, but not for the right reasons. And we'll get on to the peace deal in a second. But there has been a leak of an alleged phone call between Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy, and the Russian negotiator he was talking to, Yuri Ushakov, when Witkoff allegedly advised Russia in how to flatter Donald Trump in peace negotiations, and said to congratulate him over his deal in Gaza before making demands about Ukraine, and spoke of his personal deep respect for Vladimir Putin, and detailed what Vladimir Putin should say in any direct call to Mr. Trump. How unprecedented is this sort of thing, and how serious is it for Donald Trump and for Steve Witkoff?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The first thing that I would want to say here is the tone of the call, the nature of that is viewing Russia as a partner. You know, they're our partner, the United States, and Ukraine is an object. And so we can talk about what to do to Ukraine. That is troubling. That's the nature of the framework. What a lot of people are complaining about is that Witkoff is coaching the Russians on how to talk to Trump. Well, actually, that's going on every day all over the world. People are talking to leaders, whether it is Macron or Merz or Viktor Orban or whomever. They're saying, okay, here's how you talk to Trump. You know, you're going to have, 45 seconds. And if he's interested, he'll ask a question. Otherwise, you're done. It's things like that people will say and definitely praise him, flatter him. You know, he needs to hear that. So that sort of coaching is going on all the time. The problem with it, in this case, is who we're talking to. It is the Russians who have attacked their neighbor, killed millions of people, raped women, abducted children. They attack civilian apartment buildings, deliberately killing the civilians that live there. Viewing them as our partner is misguided and I would even say morally, bankrupt, morally off. And that's the problem with what we learn from that.
It all comes around to this 28-point plan that Steve Witkoff and Yuri Ushakov managed to come up with. And there was some question marks around where this 28-point plan came from. And I think it was sort of exemplified originally whenever Marco Rubio turned around and initially said, well, this didn't come from us, this was the Russians. And then only a few hours later, in fact, it might not have even been a few hours later, he had to say, oh, yes, we drafted this to put down. And then President Trump turned around and said it had to be signed by the 27th and came out with language that we'd last heard in the Oval Office when Zelensky was ambushed and turning around and accusing Ukraine of starting a war that they couldn't finish, accusing of Ukraine of not respecting the US for its contributions enough. What do you think was going on there? And do you think this is a sign of the dysfunctionality that there is within the administration?
Dysfunctionality, definitely. One thing that I think people always need to remember is that there isn't really a Trump administration. There is President Trump, and he has people around him. They are not fully empowered decision makers who can lead. They are there to do what he tells them to do. And Trump changes his mind or veers left and veers right fairly regularly. So the people we have sometimes speaking publicly aren't actually sure what we're doing because it's only President Trump. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think that President Trump genuinely wants an end to the war. He wants peace, and he doesn't really care about the details. And so he's frustrated when there's no process. Like if no one's talking, no one is negotiating, nothing is happening, he gets frustrated. He wants there to be a process. So here's a case where the Russians go to Witkoff and say, here's a plan, you should propose this. And Witkoff, maybe with the support of the vice president, comes out and says, okay, here's the US plan. It is, of course, horrific. It is just, as Rubio allegedly said, it is just the Russian wish list. It is, getting Ukraine to withdraw from Ukrainian territory rather than calling on Russia to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. It is putting limits on Ukraine rather than putting limits on Russia when Russia's the country that invaded. So it is completely backwards, that so-called U.S. plan. I think Trump saw how bad the plan was, but based on the reactions of everybody else, and not just Ukrainians, but Europeans and Republicans in the Senate and Republican commentators in the media. And so he realized, okay, this is a bad plan. So he dispatches Rubio to go negotiate with Ukraine and Europe to fix it, which Rubio does. And notice how we know nothing about the contents of what they negotiated, the 19 points, because Rubio, I think, is smart enough not to get that out into a public setting. This will now be presented to the Russians. So you go from having an unreasonable position presented to the Ukrainians to then working to negotiate something reasonable, which will be presented to the Russians, which the Russians will reject. Now, that is a far better situation to be in, where we have a reasonable deal on the table and Russia refuses, than to have an unreasonable deal on the table that nobody can accept, except Russia. So I think we've gotten the cart before the horse again, and then back again. So, and this is like the third time in this administration we've done this, where we get it backwards and then we get it forwards again. And that's, I think, where we are now. The challenge will be to get Putin to engage seriously, simply in ending the war. What does it take to get him to do a ceasefire? And that will require more pressure on the economy and on the military. And we've always ducked when it comes to putting pressure on Putin for reasons we just don't know, but we've never really gone there. And that's what it will take if we actually want to see peace.
So you've answered my next question. You don't think Putin's going to accept this?
No. In fact, Lavrov was out this morning saying that if this is not verbatim what was already put out there, then we're not going to accept it.
And it's interesting. The other thing that I'm picking up, looking at some of the body language between people that are in there, is that Witkoff and Rubio clearly don't get on well. Rubio, I don't think, likes Witkoff. The ambush in the Oval Office, Rubio was sitting there with his arms folded, looking very sternly as Zelensky was being attacked. And again, the confusion over this, you can see in his face. Am I right, or do they get on?
Well, I don't I don't know Witkoff personally at all. Um, I do observe, not knowing him, but observing, he has no idea what he's doing. He doesn't get the idea of an aggressor and a victim. He doesn't get the morality behind all of this, the U.S. interest at stake in peace in the world. He just wants a deal, and he thinks that the Russians are our partners. So it's just off. Clearly, that's not Rubio's view. So they're going to have disagreements. Um, Rubio has a lot of knowledge, which Witkoff does not. I mean, I remember not too long ago, Witkoff was doing an interview and he couldn't remember the names of the provinces in Ukraine that he was suggesting that Russia take over. So, I mean, none of the facts matter to him. And I think that sets up a problem, in terms of how do you manage it. Also, Rubio is the Secretary of State, so he's actually in the serious leadership position for foreign policy. Witkoff, a special envoy for the Middle East, who gets parachuted in by Trump to see whether he can talk to Putin. It's got to be very frustrating for Rubio as well. Now, you mentioned that Oval Office meeting in February, and I just want to, we talked about this before, but I want to remind that did not have to go that way. President Trump had set it up. They have a talk, then they go have lunch, and then they sign this minerals deal. And Vance interjected at the end of the meeting, I would argue, largely because he had not been on camera, that he wanted recognition that he is a player here. So he said something. And Zelensky did not need to answer the vice president. It's not his counterpart. President Trump is. It was fairly innocuous what Vance said. It was just, we're going to try diplomacy. Zelensky should have said, that's great, let's go have lunch. And instead gets into an argument with Vance, which then really devolved because then Vance is arguing back and then Trump jumps in to support Vance, and it just went worse and worse. And Zelensky did not need to do that.
Interesting. We haven't seen much of J.D. Vance, the vice president, in the current debate that's going on. And the other person we haven't seen is Pete Hegseth, the now Secretary of State for War. Has Congress approved the change of the name of his department? Because I think it has to be a congressional decision. But maybe he's tied up a little bit on what's going on around Venezuela. Both of them there. But why do you think they're not getting involved?
Well, I think Vance is involved, but I think it's behind the scenes. I think that he has supported Witkoff in presenting this plan and then negotiating it. He did make a few public comments along those lines and even a social media post. Hegseth, not so. That's true. And they've pulled in the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, to be an interlocutor here instead of Hegseth. I think that there are, as you said, other issues in the Pentagon, and Hegseth is just not in the game here. But Witkoff and Vance, I think, definitely are.
Witkoff's a lawyer, and you'd have thought that whenever he's putting a set of points out as part of a plan, that he'd stick his lawyer's hat on and bring out issues that there could be. And if you look at the 28 points, and we don't know what's in the 19-point plan that came out. There were some. It went through a 24-point plan. If this isn't confusing anyone that's listening, that the EU and Ukraine had come up with, and that had some interesting points in it. But the legal issues that didn't seem to be considered were Article 2, brackets 4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the acquisition of territory by force, which is what Russia's done. And then what President Trump was trying to do and force people's hand, which is contravening Article 52 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, i.e. coercion. And he's trying to force that in. And then there didn't seem to be anything that properly addressed how they'd bring immunity to Vladimir Putin, who's under an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, because if Donald Trump signs it, well, the US doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court. They're not signatories to it, and therefore it's up to the signatory nations and everything else whether they would accept any immunity or anything else. And therefore, President Putin could be arrested if he went into any of the signatory countries. Do you think this shows that there was little thinking put in behind the plan before it was proposed?
Yes, yes. There was very little thinking. There are so many mistakes and naivetes and oversights and things. Just as you mentioned, I could add more. It says in one of the points that the parts of Ukraine that Russia occupies will be recognized as de facto Russian. Well, that's a contradiction in terms. They're either recognized as Russian or they're not recognized as Russian. De facto means not recognized. It would be de jure if they're recognized. And so we smush this together, and now it means absolutely nothing. You have another instance where it says the US is going to mediate negotiations between NATO and Russia. Well, the United States is part of NATO, so we can hardly be the mediator. We're a participant in that negotiation. So there are just so many things that were off and not well understood, I would argue, as well as not thought through. And I do believe this came originally from the Russians and was just, tweaked minorly and put out as a U.S. paper.
From European perspective, in looking at it, Katia Kallas, on behalf of the European leaders, turned around and said that the Russians were asking for everything, but in the plan that was being produced, there seemed to be no concessions from the Russians at all. Do you think we'll ever see any concessions from the Russians?
No, I don't. I think what we're going to see in the end is an end to fighting. I don't think Russia or Putin will give up on any of their objectives. They will have all of these demands of Ukraine and all these demands of the West, and no action, no responsibility, no concessions on their part at all. But if we can get to a point where they stop attacking and we just have a ceasefire in place, I think everybody can live with that. We then deepen it, we make it last longer, we create deterrence against future attacks, we help Ukraine get on with being a sovereign, independent state again. That's where I think we'll end up.
But Zelensky proposed a similar sort of plan before Donald Trump got inaugurated. He came out and said he recognized that Ukraine could not take the territory that Russia had already captured back by force, and therefore, he would be content with parking it to be dealt with diplomatically at some stage in the future. Do you think the Russians will ever accept something like that?
Well, accept is a tricky word, because on the one hand, I can see them doing it, and on the other hand, I can see them saying that they don't accept it, that it's not good enough. They want more. But I could see them in practice having a ceasefire.
One of the things that came out with ceasefire and all the rest of it, and this is what I had forgotten, is that there's the security guarantees that come in. And again, part of the 28-point plan, we don't know if it's made into the 19-point, was the US providing an Article 5 type guarantee to Ukraine. But surely we had that under the Budapest Memorandum, where the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia had said that they were going to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. How do we convince the Ukrainians that any on-paper guarantees are actually going to be lived up to this time?
Yeah. So very good question. So the security guarantee in Europe that everyone knows, understands, and actually works is NATO. We have Article 5, and an attack on one is considered to be an attack on all, and everybody responds. And this has deterred aggression against NATO for 75 years. That is the bottom line. That's the baseline. If you then say, okay, we're not going to let them into NATO, but we will provide security guarantees, you're immediately saying it's less than NATO. And the Budapest Memorandum is a good example. It was far less than NATO. And turned out there was no backup at all. It was words on a page that no one actually lived up to. It was not a treaty obligation. There was no structure. There was no decision-making body. There was no military backup behind it. There was no positioning of forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you need something less than NATO, I guess, but more than the Budapest Memorandum. So here is what countries are then talking about. Well, we can have a coalition of the willing force deployed inside Ukraine. We can do training and equipping of the Ukrainian military. We can share intelligence. We can help Ukrainians with air defenses. And so you start adding on and on, still get to the question, well, what if Russia ignores all that and attacks anyway? What do you do? And if the answer is nothing, then there's no security guarantee. So we have to keep working on that. In the 28-point plan that Witkoff produced, there's nothing in there about security guarantees. They were referred to as if they exist, but there was no description of what they are. So that was kind of absent. I don't know, none of us know what's in the 19-point plan that Rubio has worked out with Ukrainians and Europeans. Presumably, there's a bit more on security guarantees there.
Well, it's interesting. The Ukrainians are saying that bar a little bit of work, they could potentially come out and support it. But do you think part of the rationale behind why this plan suddenly appeared was down to the threat of potential supply of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, the increased support that Donald Trump was beginning to give to Ukraine from a military perspective, and Vladimir Putin genuinely getting worried about how the war is going for him?
Yes, but let's take those in a few pieces if we can, Philip, because starting with Putin being worried, yes, he has economic problems, high inflation, high interest rates. He can't get the components that he needs, gasoline shortages because of attacks on refineries, some of which have been a long range the Ukrainians have done with their own capabilities. Uh, so all of these things he knows. Also, his military is not succeeding in Ukraine. He's losing thousands and thousands of people in military equipment and not gaining anything. And he knows that. So I think he does want to see, can he push harder and harder to get an end to the war delivered to him on terms that he wants. And that's why he's escalated his attacks on cities and the energy infrastructure right ahead of the winter to try to create a sense of greater urgency that Ukraine needs an end to the fighting. But it's because Russia is in a weak position that he's doing this. So that's that part. Now, as to this particular plan, I think we have to look at the diplomatic sequence here that took place. Zelensky was going to Washington. There was talk of tomahawks, but the U.S. was saying, not now. This is a threat, but we're not going to do it now. Putin calls and throws off the meeting between Zelensky and Trump on the Friday and promises to have a summit meeting with Trump in Budapest. And then, of course, Trump, having been fooled once by Witkoff to doing the Alaska summit, puts Rubio in charge of preparing the Budapest summit. Rubio talks with Lavrov, who says, no, we're not changing our position at all. We want everything still just like in Alaska, no change. So Rubio understands what he has heard from Lavrov and reports that, and the meeting gets called off. Well, once that meeting's called off, the Russians send Kirill Dmitriev to Florida to meet with Witkoff, avoiding Rubio to get the position into Witkoff. Here's what we want as the Russians. And of course, Witkoff doesn't push back on that, just grabs it, turns it into a plan and puts it out.
Sounds like a good soap opera. Maybe this is going to turn into a Netflix drama at some stage if it wasn't so serious and people suffering on the ground.
If they do it, I hope they do it like the death of Stalin, because as dark as it is also so ridiculous that it can be funny.
But it's a perfect example of how international geopolitics works. But the other thing that seems to be changing the minute is what's going on in the information domain. And Russia's putting out an awful lot of commentary about them being tactically successful around Pokrovsk and elsewhere in the front line, and clearly putting statements out that are untrue. Do you think that's another indication that Putin or Putin's forces are worried about what's going to come this winter?
Well, first off, they've been tactically successful for 2 years and never strategically successful. So you have to wonder what those tactical successes really amount to, if anything. They are put out there to shape information operations, to shape perceptions, but there's very little reality to them. As far as the Russians in the field go, I think they know they're not really advancing and that they can't really do this. And indeed, some of the commanders there, I think, have, what's the right expression there? I think they figured out the game, that instead of actually succeeding at taking the objective at extraordinarily high cost, they can go through the motions of attacking the objective. They lose a lot of people, but the commanders get paid off as they do this. And so they're actually very interested in the battle continuing rather than in the victory.
Can Putin afford not to have a war now?
That's a very good question, because he has transformed the Russian economy to be on a completely war footing. So they don't have the civilian jobs and civilian capacity that you would need in a normal economy. He doesn't want all of these soldiers coming home. They are now poor, battle hardened, angry, drugged, and alcoholic, and probably incapable of fitting into society. So he probably doesn't want them to come back. And because his adventure in Ukraine has been a failure, if it's really over, then everyone will see this was just a big mistake, a big failure. Whereas as long as it continues to go on, he can justify that, he's succeeding, he's winning, we have to keep fighting.
So you're an ambassador. You're there to give advice as to what's going to happen next, not just explain what's happening now. What are we going to see through the rest of this year and through 2026, do you think?
Yeah. I think the thing to do is just keep an eye on the fundamentals. The fundamentals here are that Ukraine is getting support from the US and Europe, and our economy is 22 times the size of Russia's economy. Our military forces are far more capable than the Russian military forces. We have better technology. We have equipment that actually works. The Ukrainians are there on the ground, and they are fighting, and they're going to continue to fight. So Ukraine doesn't lose here. Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent European democracy. Russia, on the other hand, is by itself. They're relying on North Korean artillery and occasionally troops, Iranian drones. They're lacking components, and they need to buy them from China. Their finances are in terrible shape. And if oil prices stay down, and if we put in place more and more sanctions, secondary sanctions on the oil and gas trade, I think Russia's going to find itself in a difficult position. I would predict that at some point next year, I was hoping it would be this year, but I don't see it anymore. But hopefully next year, Russia will get to the point where it needs a ceasefire. And then we will not have a peace deal. We will have no agreement with Russia at all. It'll simply be an end to fighting. And that should be enough. And we have to lean in at that stage to prop up and strengthen Ukraine, strengthen their military, get them on track with the EU, deploy a coalition of the willing, and deter future Russian attacks against the parts of Ukraine that Ukraine still controls. That, I think, is where we end up. And then we'll have a long-term dispute with Russia, just as we did about the Baltic states for 40 years, or as we did about Eastern Germany for 40 years.
And therefore, we will have a military commitment helping Ukraine and propping it up for decades, potentially.
Indefinitely. There's no end point to NATO. There's no expiry date. Similarly, there shouldn't be an expiration date on security guarantees for Ukraine. And ultimately, I think if that's the situation we end up in, future governments in the US and Western Europe are going to ask themselves, why are we committed to security for Ukraine in the same way we are to everybody else in NATO, but they're not in NATO? Why don't we just make it NATO? But that's not going to happen under President Trump.
Well, that's very interesting, and in a way very sad that we're not going to see a proper end to the conflict. There's a positive that comes out of it, though. That gives me plenty of excuses to invite you back onto Times Radio Frontline. Ambassador Kurt Volker, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure talking with you, Philip. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.